Hello, everybody. My name is Gautam Pemmaraju, and I'm a filmmaker and writer based in Bombay. And I'd like to thank the Foundation for Art, Culture, and Education, the FACE Foundation in Hyderabad, for inviting me to talk on an aspect of my work. I have previously worked on a project, on an art history project regarding the humor, satire, poetic traditions of Hyderabad and the Deccan, Mazaiya Shairi as it is known. This is a tradition that goes back to the late 30s, and eventually it became, uh, it took several different phases over time. And I would like to talk about one particular poet of this tradition who was active in the late 40s, in the 40s and the 50s, and a fine poet who is very well recognized and very well liked in Hyderabad. But unfortunately, he's not very well known outside of Hyderabad, unlike his contemporary and friend, the revolutionary poet Makhdoom Mohyuddin. The person I'm talking about is a poet known as Sarwar Danda. He was born Ghulam Sarwar Khan, and he adopted the pen name Danda, which is indicative of the kind of concerns that he had in his poetry. He was um, a sort of champion for the oppressed, for the voiceless, and for the downtrodden. And this is seen throughout his poetry right from the very start. He was a very strong progressive voice, um, and he was associated with the progressive movement. Many of those figures of the progressive movement during that time in Hyderabad were his friends. And he was particularly close to Makhdoom Mohyuddin, who achieved, of course, great fame across India and beyond. Sarwar Danda was very active during the 40s and the 50s. He could, in some sense, be known as a poet of the second phase of Dakhni humor and satire poetry. The first phase we see begins earlier on in the late 30s and goes into the 40s until the fall of the independent Hyderabad state, after which a few of the poets moved to Pakistan, and thereafter circumstances for many of the residents of Hyderabad, particularly for the Muslims of Hyderabad, the independent Hyderabad state, was a period of uncertainty and also tragedy for many. In this presentation, I draw from several interviews that I have conducted over the years with many experts speaking on Sarwar Danda. I also draw from my interview with Syed Mustafa Kamal, the editor of Shagufa magazine, which has been running continuously for the last 50 years. He's an Urdu and Dakhni scholar who was associated with many of these figures back in the day, and he personally knew Sarwar Danda and has spoken to me previously about his association and about Sarwar Danda himself.
सरवर डंडा में बड़ी खूबियाँ थीं। एक तो ये कि उनका सुनाने का अंदाज़ अपना बिल्कुल अलग था, शानदार तरन्नुम, और वो दखनी में जब शेर सुनाते तो लोग बस उनको सुनते रहना चाहते थे, घंटा और 1.5 घंटा उनको छोड़ते नहीं थे। और संजीदा मुशायरों में बहुत जाते थे वो, प्रोग्रेसिव राइटर्स में उनका नाम आता था। कम्युनिस्ट पार्टी के लोगों से भी उनके बहुत ख़ास टर्म्स थे, मखदूम के वो ख़ास लोगों में से थे। और जब ये मुशायरे में कलाम सुनाते तो किसी और को सुनने लोग तैयार नहीं होते थे। और कभी ऐसा हुआ कि मखदूम शेर सुना रहे हैं और आवाज़ आ गई सरवर डंडा वांटेड, और मखदूम को गुस्सा आ गया। तो बाद में ये डिसाइड हुआ कि जब कभी कोई बड़ा मुशायरा होगा तो सरवर डंडा या दूसरे जो मिज़ाह के शायर हैं, बाद में सुलेमान ख़तीब भी इसमें शामिल हो गए, तो इन लोगों को बाद में सुनाया जाए, सब मुशायरा ख़त्म हो, फिर मिज़ाह के शायर को बुलाया जाए। तो बहुत मकबूल शायर थे ये लोग, और ऐसे नहीं थे शायर कि आप जैसे कोई बहुत ही छोटे अंदाज में ह्यूमर पैदा करें या सटायर से काम लें, बल्कि उनका एक बहुत ही ऊंचा लेवल होता था, बहुत गहरी बात उनके पास होती थी, और एक मैसेज, उनके हर शेर में कोई मैसेज होता था। तो डंडा एक बहुत ही मकबूल तरीन शायर थे अपने दौर के, और उन्होंने शायरी के ट्रेंड को, मुशायरों के ट्रेंड को चेंज किया हैदराबाद में। पहले जिस तरह की शायरी को पसंद किया जाता था, उसके साथ साथ इनकी शायरी भी मकबूल होने लगी, और वो जो उन्होंने माहौल बनाया था उससे हमारी जिंदा दिलान हैदराबाद के जो मुशायरे थे उसने बहुत फ़ायदा उठाया, क्योंकि इब्तदाई एक आध मुशायरे में वो शरीक हो सके थे, बाद में उनका इंतकाल हो गया, लेकिन एक शहर में ऐसे लोगों को सुनने और समझने का माहौल पैदा किया गया उन्होंने, एक फ़ज़ा बनाई थी उन्होंने।
We know that across the Deccan, a variety of different styles of Dakhni is spoken. Hyderabad city seems to have certain cadences and certain aspects of how it is spoken. In the regions around Hyderabad, particularly in the rural areas, the Dakhni spoken there is quite different. It's quite it has got unusual words and linkages with the past that the city language does not have. Similarly, across the Deccan footprint, whether it is in Marathwada, whether it is in northern Karnataka, in Bangalore, and other regions of the Deccan, there is great variance in the way Dakhni is spoken. So, Sarwar Danda's language seems very much to be rooted in the culture and the imagery of Telangana. In fact, in some instances, he uses Telugu phrases to in some of his poems.
अब इन्होंने इदेना माँ देशम लिखी, कैसे इदेना माँ देशम को कैसा उर्दू शायरी दखनी का जो हिस्सा बनाया, ये देखिए आप। सदा मेरे गाँव को गुर्बत का मौसम, न फाखों से फुर्सत न दम में है दम, यहाँ लुंगी पी गत नहीं वहाँ उनको है रेशम, इदेना माँ देशम, इदेना माँ देशम। बड़ा पाप है यहाँ को हंसना हंसाना, सदा रीत है यहाँ की रोना रोलाना, चुपेच लड़को मर रहे घुड़ू वेंकटेशम, इदेना माँ देशम, इदेना माँ देशम। ये घुड़ू पहले नाम मुस्लिम में होते थे बहुत, तो घुड़ू और वेंकटेशम लड़के मर रहे हैं। इस तरह की बहुत चीज़ें हैं इनके पास, जिसमें तेलुगु के छोटे छोटे फ़िक्रे वो अपनी शायरी में लाते हैं। गज़लें भी हैं उनके पास। उनु हौंदी सूरत पु फुग्गे जमा को, मेरा दिल मसल रही मटकते मटकते, जो भी तुमको चाहा गया खाट पो उन, मेरी जान बच्चियों में छटकते छटकते, न मरने में शामिल न जीने में शामिल, कई साल गुजरें लटकते लटकते, मेरे गम में समदन चरागां करारें, लगियों जब ठिकाने भटकते भटकते, यूं ही उम्र कट गई ना डंडे, यूं ही उम्र कट गई ना डंडे हजरत की, ज़माने का गर्दा झटकते झटकते।
You see, Sarwar Danda was very much part of the Dakhni, contemporary Dakhni experience when you listen to him, because he also, in the manner in which his poems are recited and sung, you also have not just the sense of Dakhni as the language, but also of Telangana itself. Because you know the way, I mean, Shabana, I got Shabana to sing that as in terms of a title song for a film, but when she sang it, you could hear that it was not just the fact that it was in Dakhni, but it was also very much from Telangana. You know.
So it reflected the kind of aesthetic realities of the region.
The region gets more precisely reflected. It depends on how you use the language, whether you sing it or you speak it. It reflects, it smells of that earth. It's as simple as that.
मैं कितनी बार बोला ना जी, उजला कपड़ा पहनो नको, काला कपड़ा पहनो नको, उजला कपड़ा पहनो नको, तू सदा सबस परी रहे, गोदी हरी भरी रहे, गोदी हरी भरी रहे, तू सदा सबस परी रहे, गोदी हरी भरी रहे, गोदी हरी भरी रहे, 4 दिन की चांदनी है, दुख के तिड़का झेलो नको, काला कपड़ा पहनो नको, उजला कपड़ा पहनो नको.
I recently spoke to the scholar Syed Akbar Hyder at the University of Texas at Austin, who has previously written on the poetry of Sulaiman Khatib and Sarwar Danda, and has very interestingly contextualized the poetry and the Dakhni language and the Urdu, the regional Urdu vernacular of Hyderabad and the Deccan province in the light of the standardization of Urdu that was taking place during that period, and also placing the work of Sulaiman Khatib and Sarwar Danda against, in the context of the progressive writers movement that was that had been ongoing during that period.
That poem with the refrain, "Ide mana desham." I mean, what I saw Danda doing was basically reminding the Urdu snobs of, Hyderabad that, look, this culture is as much a part of our fabric as, as Persian is. And at the same time, also creating a satirical commentary on even the most uh, progressive elements of Urdu culture, the so-called Taraqi Pasand Musannafin, who again were quite snobby when it came to what was going on in the Deccan. What I think we need to remember is that Danda, Khatib, Raj Bahadur Gaur, Jawad Rizvi, Zeenat Sajida, um, uh, you know, um, later on, people like even Sayyida Jafar, who was much more younger than them. They were all part of a network that also had the great Makhdum, right? And that is where I think it's really helpful for us to read people like Danda and Khatib. These were not voices that were, you know, in isolation, in sort of not engagement with, without engaging with voices around them. I mean, they were in the same cultural sphere where Makhdum was writing, and Makhdum was an institution in himself. He took with him this entire culture where progressivism was evident in poetry and in prose and in literary criticism, and many different types of Urdu were reflected in what was going on in Hyderabad. I mean, the amazing Fine Arts Academy. I mean, somebody needs to write about that. I mean, just a beautiful. I mean, this was rivaling IPTA. So this is, I think, what is important. These were not sort of lonely one-off figures. I mean, and they were part of this larger culture, which was extremely progressive. I mean, the Urdu canon of Hyderabad was extremely progressive. I mean, so progressive literature was not something that was, on the sides or sort of, in a parallel stream. So, I mean, we have to acknowledge our debt, or this progressive culture has to acknowledge its debt to those that came before it. The great Telangana movement, I mean, in which many of these people were involved. Gulbarga, that was such a important center of that movement. That was sort of a formidable front of the left, right? And that was so brutally crushed. And so the in the decades to come, what you are hearing are the size of that movement. And I mean, these writings are sort of the residues of that struggle.
Sarwar Danda was not formally associated with the Communist Party, and he was not formally a part of the Writers Association. But he was very well connected with them, and he shared many of their concerns. And of course, he wrote on very similar concerns. During the early period of his activities in Hyderabad, we know that he became associated very strongly with he became associated with an organization which was under the guidance of Maktoum Mohyuddin, and I believe from what Syed Mustafa Kamal says, he, along with Suleiman Arib, another famous revolutionary poet of Hyderabad, and a couple of others, formed a small organization, and they even in the early 50s were persuaded by Maktoum Mohyuddin to contest the municipal elections, but unfortunately they lost. Sarwar Danda took a diploma in fine arts earlier on, and worked for a short while as a commercial artist. Thereafter, he joined the public works. He became a civil contractor and a registered civil contractor for the public works department, and this became his main profession. This, of course, was alongside his other activities, political activities, and poetry.
So नहूसत का मेरे घर में के जब से बोलबाला है, मेरा जीना फ़क़त यारो बिना का गीत माला है। मेरे बालम के फैशन ने ये जब से गुल खिलाया है, दिवाली उनके घर में है, मेरे घर में दिवाला है। बड़े मन्नत मुरादां से तरक्की मुझे मिल रही थी, मेरा हक मारने हारा तुम MLA का साला है। रस्म से आको मेरे अम्मा बहना भावजां बोलें, दुल्हन का रंग तो माफक है, ना गोरा है ना काला है। उन्हों चुटला लगा को दिन ब दिन चंपा कली बन रहे, अजब रंग में अजब ढंग में मेरी सौतेली खाला है।
Sarwar Danda has an important place in my view, and I'm glad you recognized it. Late 50s and early 60s, Hyderabad had a very large canvas of Urdu literary activity, both Taraqi Pasand and non-Taraqi Pasand. That decade was really very creative, I would say. Let us say 46 to again 56, it coincides with so many dates. That decade, it lasted till 60, where a mushaira of progressive writers would attract easily 10 to 20,000 people. It was a part and parcel of the transformation that was taking place. From that phase, as we move on into the 60s, Sarwar Danda emerges as a very unique personality. He made experiments. In his poetry, you have Telugu words here and there, sprinkling of Telugu words, but very crucial, very vital to understand the poem. But it's a very important contribution to our literature. He had a number of social issues on which he would be reacting, on corruption, on favoritism, nepotism, and various other things. He would be writing on them. He was no loyalist of the royalty. He was a very independent individual. And you could not put him into one block like progressive writer. He was a very independent personality. In that process, he tried to sort of resurrect some amount of Dakhini language.
Did you know Sarwar Danda personally?
Yeah, yeah.
What kind of a person was Sarwar?
He was a very nice man, very nice, lovely, affectionate person. He never quarreled with anyone. If he had to quarrel, he had the medium. That's the beauty of the man.
He was very deft in using the language that people spoke in order to kind of satirize what he saw around him and bring out the contradictions of society, bring out the contradictions of leaders, and bring to light the difficulties that the common man was facing. In his poem Janta Ki Arzi, which is addressed to the Chief Minister of that time, Neelam Sanjeev Reddy, Sarwar Danda writes, "Police ki diary mein, dande ki shairi mein, na full stop na kama, Sanjeev Reddy mama." That short excerpt shows shows Danda's attitude. True to his pen name Danda, he is asserting a strong voice. He is asserting his right to question authority. This is another very interesting aspect of the progressivism amongst several of the poets during that time.
While Sarwar Danda wrote on a lot of issues, there was a conscious effort, or even subconsciously, a lot of what was happening around him has been translated into the verse that he's come through. I'm sure you must have heard when Sanjeev Reddy was the chief minister, the Sanjeev Reddy Mama. They are very potent, powerful comments on the Congress and Sanjeev Reddy, and not maybe personally on Sanjeev Reddy, but the attitude and the arrogance of the Congress of those days. Similarly, if you look at another of Danda's poems, on the face of it, it is something which you will dismiss of no value. But if you look at it closely, Shapur wari se pahadi meri chali re ghoda gadi. He's made powerful statements against corruption, against oppression. If you look at that verse on All India Radio, when he comes to All India Radio, ये है रेडियो स्टेशन यानी परियों का जंक्शन, सुर और ताल में है अनबन, बाबू हो जाना फुटपाथ. He was commenting on a phenomenon, on an action of a stupid bureaucrat who had banned the harmonium from the studios of All India Radio, claiming that it is not an Indian instrument. Now Danda is commenting on that.
हाँ, ये तो उसका मामला ये है कि जो काम पिछले 40-50 साल में हुआ है वो बहुत शानदार है. मैं ज़्यादा तवक्को आइंदा के लिए नहीं करता, क्योंकि अब ऐसे बड़े शायर पैदा नहीं हो रहे हैं जो सलमान ख़तीब जैसी शायरी दें, ये सरवर डंडा जैसे ही शायरी करें, या फिर हिमायतुल्लाह और फिर गिल्ली नलगुंडेवी ने जिस तरह से इस दक्कनी ज़बान को आगे बढ़ाया और दक्कनी के ज़रिए लोगों को हंसाया, उस म्यार के नए लोग पैदा नहीं हो रहे हैं। और नए लोगों में कभी कभी कोई दक्कनी का एक आध वर्ड इधर उधर इस्तेमाल कर लेते हैं, लेकिन टोटली दक्कनी शायर कहलाने वाला कोई शायर नई नस्ल में पैदा नहीं हुआ है। मैं इसकी ज़्यादा तवक्को नहीं करता।
Sarwar Danda wrote on a very diverse range of topics. Apart from the difficulties of the common man, he also wrote on the region's festivals. He has written previously on the Batkama festival, which is a traditional festival of Telangana. He has written on Quli Qutub Shah. He wrote on he's even written on the 1857 mutiny. And it's very interesting to note that his in a tradition which is quite prominently seen in the region amongst the poets, his collection of poetry is titled Imli Ban, which is a tamarind forest or a tamarind orchard. This is alluding to the use of tamarind and khatta in the food of the region, and the prevalence of the use of tamarind in the region, which several of the poets and literary figures have brought up. In fact, back in the 40s, there was late 30s, 40s, there was a poet by the name of Ejaz Hussain Khatta, who eventually moved to Pakistan after 1948. I end this presentation with Nath poetry of Sarwar Danda's. Here is a very beautiful rendition of a piece of poetry of Sarwar Danda's, sung by an artist at a memorial mushaira in Sarwar Danda's name. Thank you very much.
एक वक्त था कि हम भी थे वक्त के सिकंदर, एक वक्त था कि हम भी थे वक्त के सिकंदर। अब आ गई है गुर्बत, अब तुमसे क्या छुपाना, क्यों तुमसे है मोहब्बत, अब तुमसे क्या छुपाना। गिन गिन को पट क्या हमको जब से ज़माना मारिया, गिन गिन को पट क्या हमको जब से ज़माना मारिया। क्या बन गई ये दुर्गत, अब तुमसे क्या छुपाना, क्या बन गई ये दुर्गत, अब तुमसे क्या छुपाना। एमएलए हो एमपी अंगूठा जड़ निहारे, एमएलए हो एमपी अंगूठा जड़ निहारे। अपने में नहीं नुदरत, अब तुमसे क्या छुपाना, अपने में नहीं नुदरत, अब तुमसे क्या छुपाना। दुश्मन भी और दिल पर दोनों भी राम होते हैं, दुश्मन भी और दिल पर दोनों भी राम होते हैं। डंडे में है वो खुदरत, अब तुमसे क्या छुपाना, डंडे में है वो